Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and how are you doing today? I hope you are all doing very well, and Happy New Year. Continuing with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter, today, if you don't mind, I would like to share with you some thoughts that I have with respect to a quite interesting work directed by John Carpenter. And this is from 1983. The name of this film is Christine. Before I continue, let me speak very briefly about this particular release that I have. This is from the UK label called Powerhouse Indicator, and this is what's labeled as the limited dual format edition from that label. And I think it was limited to 5,000 copies. As you can see, there's a small indication of that in the back here. But I also understand that this film is also available through what's called a non-limited edition version. I think that's the case, but if you're interested, I would just suggest checking the Powerhouse Indicator site just in case. But also, I'm not too clear as to the release history of this film on other labels and other formats, and so I'm not sure if what you're getting on the Powerhouse Indicator release here is necessarily unique to this release, or it might be found on other non-Powerhouse Indicator labels. My understanding, though, is that you can find these other features on other releases. And what are the features? So you have the audio commentary between John Carpenter and Keith Gordon, who's the star of the film, or he's one of the stars of the films. He plays Arnie Cunningham. So it's basically a conversation between the two of them. It's a very nice conversation. It feels like they are just talking and catching up like old friends, as it were. So I really like that. And John Carpenter is very giving, and he's also asking of a lot of questions about Keith Gordon and his career and all that. So plus a discussion about certain aspects of the production of the film. So a really nice at-home type of commentary track from John Carpenter and Keith Gordon. Then there is a bunch of deleted scenes, and there are a lot of them. I would say that these deleted scenes, I'm not going to go into too many details about them, but I would say as a whole, they provide extra character moments and character beats. There are places where one or two scenes might be given slight alterations, but I don't think they're necessarily major changes necessarily. For the most part, they are mostly little additions of character. There is more depth as far as the Arnie character. There is also a lot of depth in terms of, well, not a lot of depth, but there are more character moments in terms of Arnie and Arnie's mother, for example. There's also some more room for the relationship between Lee and Dennis to breathe a little bit more. That's a kind of a key relationship of the film. That's one of the things that I do want to speak to in the sort of spoiler section of this video. And there are other aspects like that, and so I think these deleted scenes are really helpful. But I would say that the film as a whole is very much like a character study, and it might be considered in terms of its marketing to be a horror film, but I actually think it's more of an intense character study. And so I think having these deleted scenes provides even further insight into these characters, which I think actually is present in the final product of the film itself, and hopefully I'll get into that later on in this video. But be that as it may, I think the deleted scenes section is very interesting and highly informative. And then there is the documentary from, it's 2003, so I think this was made available elsewhere. This is called Christine, Ignition, Fast and Furious, and Finish Line. So this is a three-part making of documentary, and it's talking about the production of the film and making it, and also what happened afterwards. And so if you're looking for some information about John Carpenter and where he stood specifically right after The Thing and what happened at the end of The Thing and the lead up as to why he ended up making this film in the first place, I would suggest checking out this documentary. I think it's pretty interesting, and not only for that, but also for specific aspects of the filmmaking. And there are some interesting bits of trivia as well that come up, and so it might be worth it. I'm sure for anyone who is a fan of this film, it's definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen it already. And then also there are other special features here, such as trailers. And then there's also an option to listen to the score, the musical score in isolation. So that's also very interesting. Plus you have the booklet, which is here, which has two essays. The first essay is by, it's called Cars and Girls by Jeff Billington, and this is written in 2016. And then also there is an essay called John Carpenter's Guilty Pleasures, which is from 1996, and it's essentially an article by John Carpenter about his so-called guilty pleasure films, and he gives recommendations essentially for films that he really enjoys. And so that's a pretty interesting set of essays there. So my understanding, therefore, is that this is a set that is really good, and also it's a dual format, so there is a Blu-ray and there's also a DVD, but it's also, please recall, this is a UK label, although if I look in the back here I can see that the DVD is indicated as being all zones and the Blu-ray is indicated as being A, B, C, so all regions. And so I understand that this, at least according to the back, I understand that this is an all region Blu-ray. If so, that's really great news. Although I do understand that this film, Christine, is also available on other labels, and so I apologize for my lack of expertise when it comes to this release history from this about this film on other labels. But if you have any more information, if you want to share, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. But I have no complaints about the Indicator release here. I think it's really great, and it's nice. It's a 2K restoration as well, so really nice picture. So with that, my friends, let me now say that if you have not seen the film Christine, please stop this video now, because I will be talking about this film in detail, including specific aspects about the ending of the film. So I don't want to give away anything to those of you who haven't seen the film. I think it's really worth one's time, especially if one is interested in pursuing the works of John Carpenter. So if you haven't seen the film, please stop this video, because the video will still be here when you come back. And when you do, it'll be my pleasure to hear your thoughts and comments about this very interesting work called Christine. Okay, so you're back, which means that you have seen the film Christine, and so you don't mind a detailed discussion about this film. So this is the film that was released in 1983, based upon the novel Christine by Stephen King. So what we have, I think, at the outset, we have a film involving John Carpenter, and also involving, to a certain degree anyway, Stephen King, as far as the author of the original novel. So you have the potential, at least from a marketing perspective anyway, of a kind of interesting horror film, or potential for an interesting horror film. You have what could be considered to be two icons of 70s and 80s horror coming together like this. And so on the one hand, there is, at least on paper anyway, much room for the horror quotient potential. And so I think that might leave many people very excited, many horror fans excited, and especially coming off the heels of a work like The Thing, which is very gruesome, very intense, and also quite bloody in many places. I think one might be coming into this film, Christine, if one didn't see it for the first time. One didn't see it before and was seeing it for the first time. Might be having certain horror genre expectations going in. Well, perhaps by the end of the film, those expectations might not necessarily have been met. And I say that because I don't consider this film to be a kind of straightforward horror genre film. Sure, it involves a horror monster in the form of Christine, although I don't think Christine is the only monster in this film. But as a kind of thinking about this film on paper, the monster would appear to be Christine, this haunted car, this possessed car. Although I think we can see from the film that this monster car seems to have been a monster car from the very beginning, from inception, from the production line of the car itself. It seems to have had a life of its own. So it's a really interesting take. You know, the film doesn't necessarily go into the details as to why Christine the car is the way that she is, and why she is a monster like this. Was she possessed? Was she not possessed, or was she always like this? And I think this goes into one of the differences between the book and the novel. I think the book goes into some detail as to why the car is like the way it is. There's a reason for that, whereas the film just goes straight into an understanding that there's something wrong with the car from the get-go. So it's more left unexplained, but perhaps that's not the focus of the film's approach. And I think that goes into what I'm trying to get at here, which is the film is not, in my eyes, trying for horror genre quotient filling. In other words, there aren't any grand spectacles of off-the-wall bloody violence. There's much that is implied, of course. There's much violence that is shown off-screen, but nothing that is in your face shown on-screen. There are no, there are no blood and guts scenes of that sort of nature. And that, I think, indicates a kind of focus of the film, which I tried to hint at before with the notion that Christine as a car, as a character, is shown in the film to be kind of evil from the get-go, or alive from the get-go. We don't get any more information about the background of Christine in terms of why she ended up the way she ended up. So since we don't get those that background, it seems to me anyway that a horror film would focus on the background of Christine, how she came to be the evil car that she was, and that sort of thing. But since we don't get that here in this film, my sense is that we are getting something that is not necessarily a straightforward horror genre film. And I think that's further indicated by the fact that while we do get scenes of the car attacking certain characters, the bullies, Arnie's bullies, the car is attacking certain other people, there are certain death scenes that we do see on screen. The way in which this comes about, I would suggest, is not a fully throated assault on the senses, in-your-face horror film. Okay, and that's due to the fact that there are lacking certain special effects scenes involving car attacking people and that sort of thing. It's just not there. It's not there. It's all off screen, or it's more or less implied. It's still very effective, don't get me wrong. There's something quite chilling with the iconic scene involving the car after it's been blown up at the gas station, and all but one of the bullies, Buddy, is left standing, and Buddy's now running away, right, alone on the nighttime highway, and with the Christine in flames slowly pursuing him, and the music is swelling and building up. Now we understand it's the John Carpenter music on the soundtrack, and just goes and goes, and suddenly we see the final results of that, and Buddy, unfortunately for him, loses out. But there's something quite iconic about that particular moment. So don't get me wrong, this film does have its moments of horror, but my point is that this doesn't feel like a straightforward horror genre film. My sense, however, is that this is a film that is a love story, that is at its heart a kind of human drama, at the center of which is a group of characters, including the character of Arnie Cunningham, played by Keith Gordon. So Arnie Cunningham is at the core of this film. And then there's also his relationship with Christine, also his relationship with Dennis, who is, it seems to be his best friend, or one of his best friends, or one of his only friends in the school. And then also his relationship, Arnie's relationship, that we see later on between himself and the new girl at school, who is Lee. It's the relationship that he has with her, and they eventually break up, or it's kind of a breakup, but Lee is still concerned and worried about Arnie and the car. What do you know about the car? She asks Dennis. And so it's these relationships that I think are at the center of this film. It's a very interesting, I'm not sure, love triangle or quadrangle. I'm not sure what the situation is, but there are a lot of players, actually. There's Christine, Dennis, Arnie, and Lee. And also you can add on to that the other characters in the periphery. You have the bullies, right? Buddy and his gang. And then you have Darnell. And then you have the parents, Arnie's parents, in particular Arnie's mother. And then you have the Harry Dean Stanton character, the police detective Junkins. So you have them in the periphery. And I would actually suggest that the characters of Arnie's parents, mother and father, in particular the mother, I think is a very key relationship in Arnie's inner circle. And I think that's one of the focuses of the foci of the film, how the relationship exists and how it has affected Arnie, and how it sort of disintegrates as Arnie's relationship and obsession with Christine just grows and grows and grows with greater intensity over a short period of time. And how that essentially affects and destroys the relationship that Arnie has with his parents, which I think was on probably some shaky ground to begin with. But well, we can maybe talk about that a little bit later if we have time. So my point here is that I think the film Christine is an intense drama film, and I think that's the point of the film. And I think as that focus, I think it works quite effectively. And I think it works effectively because of the intense performances, or the great performances by everyone concerned, but in particular, my friends, the intense performance by Keith Gordon as Arnie Cunningham. Now, I mentioned before that I don't think this is a horror film per se, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that if I think about the Arnie Cunningham role and the Keith Gordon performance as Arnie, that's a really scary performance. And I think maybe the horror element, I think we can say, belong to how Arnie transforms over the course of the film after he meets Christine. And his transformation, I would suggest, is, I think, the most horrifying and chilling part of this film. And it's chilling because we see the way in which he becomes colder. He disregards certain little friendly conventions. He is ruder to his parents, of course. And I think on the one hand, we might feel a little bit of sympathy for Arnie at first, because his parents seem to be very overbearing, and in particular his mother seems to be very overbearing, very strict, over-controlling, that sort of thing. So on the one hand, it might feel somewhat liberating, at least on the part of the viewer. I know I felt this way when we see those scenes of Arnie breaking free and really fighting back against his parents in terms of their authority over him. It just breaks down. But there is a point where it turns into something quite sinister. When the father is trying to berate Arnie for being so rude to his mother, right after Christine has been destroyed by the gang. And so he is despondent at the dinner table. So it's just him and his mother and father at the dinner table. And then the father says, "We've decided we want to help you buy a new car." And then Arnie, instead of being very happy and grateful at that, what I would think to be quite generous news, he becomes even ruder, and he's swearing at them, and then he just runs off, and his father has had enough, and he just chases after him and says, "I want you to go back and apologize to your mother," and Arnie refuses, and they have a little scuffle. But then Arnie does that little thing with his hand over the throat of the father, and the light falls, and the light is cast upwards, creating this eerie moment. It's one of the eeriest moments of the film. The father has this look on his eyes of fear, total terror at his son, who there's this notion that his son might even go so far as to injure him. I don't know, but he doesn't go that far. He just gives a very condescending tap on the cheek, and he says, "I'm going to bed." So that's an example, my friends, of the transformation of Arnie. And the transformation is further shown by how those flippant and sort of throwaway remarks that he gives to Dennis. He's a little bit condescending of Dennis after Dennis has broken his leg and he's trying to walk on crutches, etc. And he seems to be there might be some remnants of the friendship that they had, but it's certainly gone a sour path in that final scene, or the penultimate scenes between Arnie and Dennis when they're driving in Christine, and he says, "Let's toast to death," and that sort of thing. And those are sort of chilling moments. And there's a chilling line that Arnie gives earlier when Arnie is visiting Dennis in the hospital for the first time, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, "Do you think that parents are trying to kill their kids?" and that sort of thing. And so there is this notion of death that's surrounding and swirling Arnie's conversation. And this is shown also in his face and his visage as well, and his eyes. They seem to be bulging out of his head. His skin becomes a little bit paler, and to the point where at the end of the film, with the final confrontation between Dennis and Lee on the one hand, and then Christine on the other, we realize that, at least at that moment in the film, Arnie is in the car. And Arnie, we see a quick shot of Arnie. We hear him shout out, or the voice shout out, I don't want to swear here, but S-H-I, and then you can say the rest, ers. So, and then we also see a quick shot of his face in the car after Christine has sort of regenerated in the middle of the battle. And we see it's very grotesquely lit with this blue, eerie, greenish blue light, and Arnie has this death look on his face. And then it's a final attack before, unfortunately, Arnie flies through the windshield, of course, and he dies after that. But my point is that the transformation of Arnie is, I think, the most terrifying part of the film. And I think that if we're going to call this film a horror film, I think that is the source of the horror. And I think it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And it's all down to the performance by Keith Gordon, but also the performances of the actors around him, how they respond to him, how they react against him, and that sort of thing. It's really quite great, and it's very chilling, very, very chilling. It's made even more chilling, of course, by those moments in the film where we see glimpses of Arnie's humanity. And I think that's shown quite effectively in his relationship with Lee. And there are moments where after they have a kind of breakup, after their quite disastrous date at the drive-in, where Lee almost chokes to death thanks to Christine. And Arnie doesn't necessarily show that kind of sympathy that one would want. He seems to be quite aggressive, and perhaps even overly so, especially considering the fact that, a couple more seconds and I think Lee could have even died in that scene. So, but they still get back together. And I think it's really great because there's a moment where I think Lee seems to be convincing Arnie that, while Christine is obviously a very important part in Arnie's life, Arnie still seems to be trying to find room for Lee. And he's saying almost to the point, maybe we should apply to the same colleges. And so maybe if we go to the same one, we can still see each other. And Lee is very obviously quite open to that. And so there is at least a glimpse of possibility that Arnie can be saved. And I think that savior aspect of the film is shown through the relationship between him and Lee. And I think that's really, it's appropriately timed. It's well placed in the film because it comes just prior to Arnie's discovery of the destruction of Christine he wasn't there, but he can assume that it was by Buddy and his gang. And then if you notice when he walks to Darnell's garage and he sees the extent of the damage, his face just turns and he becomes completely cold and just so into Christine, to the point where when Lee tries to console him, he just attacks her, verbally attacks her, and then that's it. And so that's essentially the trajectory of the film, and it's followed, or it's in parallel to the trajectory of Arnie Cunningham as a character. And so his transformation becomes, I think, the core of the horror of the film, and I think therefore it becomes very effective, very, very effective, and very chilling, even to the end. Even at the end where he is essentially dying after having been flung through the windshield in a very violent manner, and he's all bloodied up. He gives that final, is it an attack on Lee or is it a kind of embrace on Lee? It's that final jump scare in the garage office. And so it might have been an attack, it might have been an embrace, I'm not sure. But I don't think we could ever tell, because he is too weak to be able to go through whatever it was he's going to go through, because he has been impaled with this very large piece of glass. And so that essentially kills him. Before he dies, of course, he gives one final goodbye to what we understand now to be the love of his life, which was Christine. And Christine, too, shows an equal moment of essentially mourning the loss of her loved one as well. So maybe at the end, Arnie hadn't been saved, and I think we can tell that because of that quick shot of his face in the car prior to the final showdown. But there had been some possibility, some potential for being saved that had been sprinkled earlier in the film, of course, but it wasn't meant to be. But what was meant to be, of course, was Arnie's relationship with the car, with Christine. And so let's now focus my attention on, or let me focus my attention on the star of the film, really the centerpiece of the film. If Arnie's trajectory and his transformation form, I think, a sort of emotional, chilling core to the film, and I think its set piece, its face of evil, as it were, which is it's an alluring and beautiful face, and it's still quite a dangerous and ominous one as well, is that of the car Christine, the Plymouth Fury Christine. And so this is the 1958 Plymouth Fury Christine. It's called Christine. It's named Christine. That's what the former owner named it, and so that name sticks. And that's what her name is. And it is a she. It is treated as, or it is, Arnie calls Christine a she, calls her Christine. And so there is, of course, this idea that this is a love story between Arnie and Christine, and it's set up like that from the very get-go, right? When the car, when Dennis and Arnie are driving past, and they first see it in the LeBay house there, they see it, and Dennis doesn't see it at first, but Arnie does, and it's almost like a love at first sight type of thing. You bring the car back, he says to Dennis, and he noticed it immediately. It's just like one of those scenes in a love story, where someone sees someone else, and it's love at first sight. So that is a kind of a great setup for what a really interesting, intense, in many ways perhaps perverse, love story between two characters in a John Carpenter film. This is in many ways also a deep love story between Arnie and Christine, and it's this intense love that I think leads to the transformation of Arnie Cunningham as a character, as I tried to allude to earlier in this video. It's also this intense love that somehow brings Christine back, and I don't want to get into too much as to the psychology of Christine necessarily, but the prior owner had died, and so Christine was sort of left rotting in the yard there until Arnie Cunningham discovered her and saw her, and then slowly worked so hard to restore her and rebuild her to her past glory. And it's quite a glorious car. It's really very beautiful. I'm not a car guy. I'm not into automobiles necessarily, but even I have to acknowledge that this is a really beautiful looking car, really, really lovely, and there is a really great, palpable, almost sexiness to this relationship, and it's I think, again, I'm not into cars, but I can appreciate the fact that there is a really intense relationship, or there is a kind of intensity and great affection that people can have for automobiles. And I say that with great respect, of course, because I think the film does this really well too. It shows us also the type of work that is needed to get the car back into shape. When Arnie is going through working at Darnell's, trying to get everything back together, I can really sense the care it takes, and we also know that it's not just overnight. It takes a number of weeks and maybe some months before the car can get back together, but it's all down to Arnie's persistence, his love and dedication for the car, wanting to bring it back to its full glory. And so even for someone like myself who doesn't necessarily understand cars that well, I can really appreciate, because the film really helps me appreciate this love of cars through Arnie's love of Christine, if you know what I mean. And so I think that is a really great thing, and it's a great deed that the film does to help me appreciate this love of cars that is, I think, also very important to this film. What the Christine character brings in to this film, not only does it bring in this sort of horror action element, and it does very well. I mentioned earlier that I don't think this is a straightforward horror film, and I still don't. I would contest that the horror elements come from the transformation of Arnie as a very shy, somewhat awkward character to one that becomes overly confident to the point of being frightening. That's the source of the horror. But the Christine scenes, I don't think, therefore, are lacking in any kind of tension or entertainment or suspense. On the contrary, they are quite suspenseful and very entertaining and very engaging, and quite eerie when we think of what is actually occurring, the violence that's occurring off screen, when you have all these people essentially dying, being crushed by Christine in somewhat violent ways, or being destroyed, run over, burned to death, and that sort of thing. And so and you know, I think it's Junkins who's talking about what happened to Moochie, right? We see the first attack by Christine on one of the kids, who's Moochie, and he's alone, and it's under these, I think, these bridges, or there's a empty storage facility, and for whatever reason, Moochie decides to run into this dead end, and then the car, you know, it's one of the famous scenes where the car just wedges itself through and crushes Moochie to death. We don't see the actual impact. We see the camera from the car from the camera's point of view, or the camera POV, and it goes into Moochie's stomach, and then that's all we see. We don't see the actual gross stuff. We hear about what happens from Junkins. You know, Junkins explains later to Arnie when he meets him, the police detective. He says, you know, they had to scrape what was left behind of Moochie, and it's quite a gross description of it. But so my point is that the car scenes, the car attack scenes, while they don't show all this gruesome stuff on screen, I don't think that really matters. I think there is still a lot of action suspense that's shown with the car moving and the car, you know, ramming into things, and also chasing people and that sort of thing. It's a really dangerous stunts that are being involved here. So there's also that as well. And the burning car, which I mentioned earlier, which is one of the most breathtaking images of the film. So all that stuff, I think, is really quite entertaining and quite suspenseful. There's also the supernatural element of the car, which is shown so captivatingly by the fact that we see sometimes the car regenerating. You know, it's in this damaged state, and it just grows out of its body back into its original state. It's what's called Porn Man's process, I think it's called. It's essentially reverse photography, and this is acknowledged by John Carpenter in the audio commentary, of course. But they essentially took a rigged car and they crushed it in a certain way, so it would bend in a certain direction, and then the film was reversed, so it looked like it was popping out and back into its original shape. So I think that's just a really effective way to show Christine and the resurrection of Christine, as it were. And it's a really effective way to show Christine as a living, breathing thing. And you can't destroy Christine. Another way that they show Christine as a living, breathing thing is, of course, the use of the songs on the radio. The 50s rock and roll, to indicate maybe Christine is talking through the songs. I think the most effective one for me was when Dennis was walking into Darnell's garage at night, just trying to figure out what Christine was, and then you remember he's by himself, and it's at night and it's quiet, and he tries to break into Christine, and suddenly the radio turns on. I think Little Richard, right? Keep on knocking, but you can't come in. It's a brilliant way to use a rock and roll song. It's almost like Christine is speaking through the rock and roll. This use of Christine and the 58 Plymouth Fury and the rock and roll songs from the 50s, this American, almost rockabilly or rock and roll vibe, also allows the film to explore this idea of Americana, 1950s Americana, American life and society, which is infused also with this love of cars, love of automobiles, rock and roll, the look, this hometown, small hometown, slice of life America, with paper bag lunches, with yogurt and glasses with thick frames that you fix by putting white tape around, and that sort of thing. I think it all comes together to provide this slice of life 50s style America, or an homage, if you will. And still in the through the lens of late 70s, early 80s America. That's for sure. I completely get that, and I think it's also shown quite effectively in the use of music. You know, the 80s versions of 50s style rock and roll music, I think, appears once or twice in the film. It that drives that point home, of course. But still we do have a looking back on a period of life that is that I think we can see in John Carpenter's filmography as being something that he has quite a great affection for. I think the prime example of this prior to Christine was the fact that he made the television film Elvis, and so Christine feels like an almost a loving homage to this period of life, 50s, these kinds of cars, this kind of lifestyle, going to the drive-in, the rock and roll, and all that stuff. And then even with Lee's last line in the film, God, I hate rock and roll. I think that line just drives home the fact that this film has been, in many ways, a kind of homage to the past, and it's been using the past in the context of these horror or sort of frightening psychological human drama terms that I think that give the filmmakers the opportunity to explore these images, but also play with them and also see what one can do with those sorts of past images in the more modern day 70s, 80s context. And so I thought this film was doing a lot of things at once and doing them quite well. And once again, I wouldn't call it a straightforward monster film, although there are moments where the film tends towards that. I think at the very end of the film, or not the very end, but the very last battle, we remember Christine is in the empty Darnell garage, and she's crashing into things, and then she backs up, and we see the front part of Christine sort of all jagged like that. It's like her front part has become an open mouth with jaws, and one of the headlights is almost is dangling out like an eyeball dangling out of its socket almost. It's quite an interesting image. So the car has become monstrified, as it were, even if for a moment, because actually after that the car regenerates itself. But there are moments, I think, where the imagery of the monster is applied to the car quite vividly, of course. And of course the car itself is meant to be the monster, but I don't. It is more the focus of the film being the relationship between Arnie and Christine, and also the transformation of Arnie and Christine. That's what I really think, with horror trappings that occupy the periphery, of course. But that is, I think, at the heart of this film. And I didn't speak about the differences between the book and the film, the Stephen King book and the film Christine. That wasn't the point of this video. And so if you were looking for that, I apologize, but that I'm not. I wasn't planning on doing that. I have read the book, but not recently. I've read it a number of times, many years ago, in fact. But if I were to mention a couple things to close this in terms of the differences between the book and the film, just very generally, of course, those of you who know the book know that while there are certain similarities, of course, there are certain differences that I think are quite significant and that turn the film away from the book. I would argue that the book is more of a horror film or horror story involving ghosts and possession, and also there's more of that sort of thing. Whereas here in the film, I think while we understand that Christine is somehow a supernatural car thing, we never get the reasons why. We don't get anything necessarily about ghosts or possession of the car. We just get Christine, who she is, as she is from the very get-go. And then from that, we get the relationship between Christine and Arnie. We do get the relationship between Christine and Arnie in the book as well, don't get me wrong, but my sense is that there is something of a focus on the possessive nature of this intense love relationship between Arnie and Christine that is at the focus of it. And this seems to be at the heart as to why Arnie transforms in the way that he does versus the reasons why Arnie becomes the way he is in the book. I think the book is in itself, I think, a very effective work, but I think this change of the film to this focus between Arnie and the car, and also the focus on the transformation of Arnie itself as a result of this relationship, I think makes the film more, let's say, relatable, and it turns it into a film where one can recall maybe it's happened to some of us in real life, in terms of maybe we knew people who maybe met some people, and then they fell into really deep and intense relationships that changed that person for the better, or maybe not for the better. Who knows? I mean, in other words, I think there's a way of identifiability with the characters through the approach that the filmmakers give that I think are otherwise differences from the original source material. Therefore, I think the film is a very successful and very effective work, and that makes the Arnie transformation, at least for me, very identifiable, and the more identifiable it becomes, the more chilling and more effective its overall effect is. So I think I would again, this is a general discussion about the book and the film, and I apologize for its overgenerality, but I think my point is that the way that the film turns away from the book, I think, is what gives, at least the film as a cinematic experience anyway, one's ability to connect with the characters even strongly, and this places further emphasis on the fact that this is, I think, at its heart, a human drama and a love story, and one that is, in those terms, quite effective. Okay, my friends, let me stop there. And so, what do you think? Are you as into the film Christine as I am? Maybe you are into it more than I am. I am really into it, of course, but if you have any thoughts or comments about this film, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. As always, I would love to hear what it is you have to say. Okay, my friends, that's it for now. And so I will continue with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter going forward as quickly as I can. In the meantime, of course, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers.